In the world of organized crime in New York City, silence was the most expensive luxury money could buy. And Imogen Farley had been selling it for 6 years without ever realizing it. She wasn't the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. She knew that. She had made peace with it sometime around her 27th birthday, sitting in a fluorescent-lit break room, eating a sandwich alone, while the rest of the office celebrated someone else's promotion. Imogen was 5'4", broad-shouldered, with thick dark hair she kept in a bun because it was practical, and a mind like a steel trap that nobody had bothered to respect yet. She wore the same 3 blazers on rotation. She kept her desk immaculate. She arrived at 7:45 every morning and left when the work was done, which was usually sometime after 8 at night. She was the senior financial analyst for Thorn Capital Partners, a private equity firm on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan that smelled like leather and money, and the faint, clean bite of something dangerous. What the letterhead didn't say, what no letterhead anywhere would ever say, was that Thorn Capital Partners was the legitimate face of the Thorn Syndicate, the most quietly powerful organized crime operation on the eastern seaboard, and the man at the center of all of it was Caelan Thorn. Imogen knew. She had figured it out 18 months into the job, the way she figured out everything, by paying attention to the numbers when everyone assumed she was too busy to look up. The money moved in patterns that legitimate PE firms didn't produce. The client names cycled through shell entities, registered in jurisdictions that didn't ask questions. The cash flow timing aligned with federal seizure reports she tracked out of professional habit. She never said a word, not because she was afraid, though she was, sometimes, in the quiet hours of early morning when the city was still, and the full weight of what she knew settled on her chest like something cold. She stayed silent because she was good at her job, and because Caelan Thorn paid her very well, and because some part of her had decided that as long as the numbers balanced and nobody asked her to sign anything she shouldn't sign, she could live inside the gray area and call it a career. Caelan Thorn was 38. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been assembled for maximum intimidation, sharp jaw, dark eyes that caught everything and gave nothing back, hair the color of an overcast sky that he wore slightly too long for a man of his position. He wore bespoke suits and he never raised his voice. In 6 years, Imogen had heard him raise his voice exactly once, and it was in Italian, and the man on the receiving end had not come back to the office afterward. To Caelan, Imogen was an asset, a high-functioning, extremely reliable, professionally invisible asset. He addressed her by last name in meetings. He forwarded her documents with a single line of instruction and expected them handled. He didn't ask about her weekend. He didn't ask about anything outside the perimeter of her function. In 6 years, she could count on one hand the number of times he had looked at her, really looked at her, the way a person looks at another person's rather than a tool. And she had stopped expecting it sometime around year 3. She was, in the language of his world, furniture. Very expensive, very functional furniture. The night it all changed, there was a thunderstorm moving up the coast, and Imogen was the last person left on the 43rd floor. It was a Thursday in March, 10:30, and she was deep inside a reconciliation report that had 17 discrepancies she hadn't been able to explain yet. She had taken off her blazer, her reading glasses were on. She had a cold cup of coffee at her elbow and a knot between her shoulder blades that hadn't released in 4 days. She heard the elevator. That was unusual. The building went quiet by 9 most nights. She heard voices, low, clipped, the kind of voices that didn't want to be heard, and then the stairwell door at the end of the hall, and then footsteps moving fast. She pulled off her glasses and sat very still, the way she always did when something registered as wrong, before she could name why. Caelan came through the glass doors of the main office, like he was moving through a building that was already on fire. Behind him were 2 men she recognized from the lobby security detail and one she didn't. A lean, sharp-faced man in a grey coat who was holding his left arm against his side in a way that suggested the arm was not doing well. Behind them all, a fourth man she'd never seen before was watching the hallway. Caelan stopped when he saw her. For one full second, neither of them moved. Farley. His voice was flat, controlled, the voice he used when he was managing something that could tip either way. "Why are you still here?" It was not a question. "Reconciliation report," she said. 17 open items. He looked at her for another second. Then he looked at the men behind him. Then he made a decision with his eyes that she couldn't read and crossed the room to where she was sitting. "Shut the computer down," he said quietly. "Come with me." "Where?" "Now." She shut the computer down. He took her through the inner corridor, past the boardroom, past the archive room, to a door she had always assumed led to a server closet. It did lead to a server closet. It also led, through a second door behind a rack of equipment, to a room she had never known existed. It was maybe 12 by 12, low lighting a deep red tone from secondary bulbs along the floor. A metal table, 2 cots folded against one wall, a first aid kit the size of a suitcase, water, protein bars, a comms unit bolted into the corner. A room designed to be survived in. One of the security men, Decker, she knew him by face, helped the injured man onto the table and opened the first aid kit. Caelan was already on the comms unit. The fourth man stayed by the inner door. Imogen stood in the middle of all of it and breathed. "Sit down," Caelan said, not looking at her. "Don't touch anything." She sat down on one of the folded cots. She did not touch anything. She watched Decker work on the injured man's arm with the methodical calm of someone who had done this before and would do it again. And she told herself that her heart rate was elevated because of the situation, and not because she was sealed in a 12 by 12 room with the most dangerous man she'd ever met. 90 minutes passed. The comms unit went quiet. The injured man stabilized, a through and through, she gathered, from fragments of low conversation she wasn't meant to hear. The fourth man was gone. Decker and the other guard had moved to the outer server room, visible through the slotted door, keeping watch. That left Caelan. He had taken off his jacket. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows. He was sitting on the table the injured man had vacated, and he was looking at her. "You're not panicking," he said. "I don't find it useful," Imogen said. Something in his expression shifted. "Not much, just enough." "How long have you known?" he said. "About the firm." She held his gaze. There was no point in the performance anymore. 18 months in, she said. The Cayman routing was the tell. The timing intervals on the Meridian Fund didn't match any legitimate arbitrage strategy I'd ever seen. He was quiet for a moment. "And you stayed." "The work is interesting," she said, "and I'm good at it." He looked at her for a long time. The red light did strange things to the planes of his face, made him look less curated, more real. She was aware that they were very close in a very small room, and that this was the longest conversation they had ever had in 6 years, and that some wire in her chest was pulling taut in a way she had no professional category for. "Nobody's going to hurt you," he said. It came out lower than his boardroom voice, more direct. "Whatever you think is happening tonight, you're not part of it." "I didn't think I was," she said, "but thank you." He almost smiled. It was such a near thing that she almost missed it. "Farley," he said. "Thorn, you've been here 6 years. 6 years and 4 months. I looked at your file once," he said. "When we hired you, top of your class at Georgetown, passed on 3 offers from firms that would have paid you twice what we do. The work here is more interesting," she said again. "That's the second time you've said that. It's still true." He was watching her with something she had no name for, something that was not the boardroom look, not the asset assessment look, something that belonged to a room like this one, small and sealed and stripped of pretense. "I owe you an apology," he said. She blinked. Of all the sentences she had prepared herself for, that was not one of them. "For 6 years of treating you like a very sophisticated spreadsheet," he said. "You deserved better than that." The room was very quiet. The hum of the servers was the only sound. "You're saying this now," she said carefully, "because we're locked in a room together. I'm saying it now because it's true, and I've been avoiding it for approximately 4 years. That landed somewhere in the center of her chest and stayed there. Later, much later, she would not be able to account for it with any precision. The sequence of events that followed was not logical. It was adrenaline and proximity, and 6 years of pretending she didn't notice the way he moved through a room, the way he trusted her work without ever acknowledging that trust, the way she had quietly built the financial architecture of his empire and asked for nothing but a paycheck in return. She was not naive. She knew what kind of man he was. She knew what world he moved in. But in that room, in that red light, with the adrenaline still working through both their systems and the storm moving outside over the city they couldn't see, the distance between them collapsed, and neither of them moved to stop it. By the time Decker knocked on the door at 4 a.m. to say the corridor was clear, Imogen had reorganized her entire understanding of her own life. The ride down in the elevator was silent. Caelan said, in the lobby, "I'll have a car take you home. I can take the subway," she said. Imogen. It was the first time he had used her first name in 6 years and 4 months. "Take the car," he said. She took the car. The next morning he was the first one in. She was the second. He handed her a document at 8:02 a.m. without making eye contact and asked for a review by noon. His voice was the boardroom voice. His face was the boardroom face. The room had never existed. The night had never happened. She was a very sophisticated spreadsheet again. She sat at her desk, and she looked at the document and she understood, with perfect clarity, that she was not going to cry about it. She had built an entire career on seeing things clearly. She was going to see this clearly too. What she could not see clearly, approximately 6 weeks later, was the second line on the test she was holding in the single-stall bathroom of the 43rd floor at 7:38 in the morning. She had gone still in the way she went still when the numbers didn't match. That particular quality of silence that was her brain insisting there must be an error before it allowed itself to believe the result. There was no error. She sat on the edge of the sink counter, and she breathed, and she thought about the options with the same methodical structure she applied to everything else. She thought about them for approximately 4 minutes. Then she stood up, put the test in her bag, and went to her desk. She was going to handle this. She was very good at handling things. What she was not prepared for was Caelan coming out of his office at 7:51, early, almost never happened, and crossing directly to her desk and stopping 3 feet away from her with an expression she couldn't categorize. "My office," he said. "I just got in. Imogen." She followed him. He closed the door. He didn't sit down. He stood by the window with the city laid out behind him like a claim he was making, and he looked at her with those dark eyes that caught everything. "Decker saw you at the pharmacy last night," he said. She felt the floor shift. "He mentioned it to me this morning because he noticed what you bought." His jaw was tight, because that's his job and he's thorough. "I told him to mind his business." "Good advice," she said very steadily. "Is it mine?" Not a question, never a question with him. She met his gaze and held it the way she'd learned to hold things, with both hands without flinching. "Yes." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. "Okay," he said. "That's your response?" "I'm working up to the rest of it," he said. "Give me a moment." She watched him think. It was not something she had ever been permitted to watch before. The real thinking, not the boardroom performance of it. His hand was at his jaw. His eyes had moved to the window. "I want to be clear about something," he said, turning back to her. "I'm not going to suggest you handle this quietly and go back to normal. That's not what's going to happen here. Then what is going to happen?" "That depends on what you want," he said. "Not what I want. What you want." She stared at him. In 6 years, no one in this building had ever led with that question. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Then we figure it out," he said. "Together, Caelan." "I have been," he said, with a kind of controlled difficulty she had never heard from him before, "aware of you for considerably longer than I've given you any indication of. The way I handled that awareness was wrong, the morning after. What I did was wrong. I knew it, and I did it anyway, because I didn't have a framework for what was happening, and I defaulted to control, and that was cowardly." The word landed, She had never heard him call himself anything. "I'm not going to pretend I know how to do this," he said. "I know how to run an empire. I know how to move money and manage risk and handle threats. I don't know how to." He stopped. "But I'd like to try. If that's something you'd consider." "You're asking me," she said slowly, "if I would consider giving you a chance, after 6 years of treating me like a line item." "Yes," he said, "that is what I'm doing. That is an extraordinarily poor negotiating position for a man of your standing. I'm aware, and you're leading with it anyway." "I'm trying something different," he said. Apparently the old strategy wasn't working. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the city moved in its usual relentless way, indifferent to the conversation happening 43 floors above it. "I'm not going to make this easy for you," she said. "I'm not asking you to. I have conditions. Name them. My position here is not contingent on whatever happens between us. My work stands on its own. The moment you or anyone in this organization treats it as anything other than that, I walk agreed. I'm not moving into anything, going anywhere, or changing anything about my life until I decide it makes sense for me. Not for optics. Not for the organization. For me. Understood. And you tell me things," she said. "Not everything. I know how this world works. But you don't keep me in the dark about things that affect my safety or my choices. Not again." He was quiet. Then, "Yes, those aren't negotiable. I didn't try to negotiate them." She was quiet for a moment. The city moved. The servers hummed somewhere below them. "I'm keeping my apartment," she said. "I wasn't going to suggest otherwise. I have a very complicated bookshelf system, and I'm not dismantling it." He looked at her. Something in his face was doing that almost smile thing again. "Farley," he said. "Thorn, I'm glad you didn't take those other offers." She picked up the file she'd carried in with her and held it against her chest like armor. "So am I," she said. Most days. She went back to her desk. She was 90% certain she had just made a decision that was going to be either the best or the most complicated thing she had ever done, and she was unable at this moment to determine which. Both. Probably both. The next 4 months were not simple. Caelan Thorn did not do anything by degrees. He was, she discovered, constitutionally incapable of halfway. When he decided to let her in, he let her in, into the real operations, into the strategy conversations, into the parts of his world that required actual trust rather than professional utility. He asked for her analysis on things she had previously only glimpsed. He sat across the table from her and argued with her about approach, and listened when she pushed back, and changed his mind twice in October alone. He also learned her coffee order without being told. He learned that she ate at her desk when she was stressed, and went for walks when she was thinking. He learned that she had a sharp, dry humor she'd been suppressing for 6 years, because she hadn't thought it was welcome in the office. "You've been funny this whole time," he said one evening in November when she made a remark that startled a real laugh out of him. Unpracticed, genuine, a laugh he didn't appear to have expected. "I've been employed this whole time," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her across his desk. The city was dark outside the windows, all lit up and indifferent. "Not anymore," he said quietly. She understood what he meant. There was still a distance between them, the specific distance of two people who have been burned once and are navigating the scar tissue. It was not easy, and it was not comfortable, and it was real in a way that the clean architecture of her work was not. She went home to her apartment every night, and she lay awake sometimes and thought about the gap between what she had built professionally and what she was only now beginning to allow herself to want personally. She thought about it with the methodical rigor she applied to everything else, which was probably not how other people experienced falling in love, but it was the only way she knew. In December, there was an incident. She was in the building late. Again, always, the work was always there. When 2 men came off the elevator who were not supposed to be in the building, she was alone on the floor. She had enough time to lock the boardroom door and send one text before they reached the glass doors. 40th floor, 2 men, uninvited. The response came in 40 seconds. "Don't move." She did not move. It took 11 minutes. She spent them sitting under the boardroom table with her back against the wall, and her phone in her hand, and a degree of calm that she would later recognize as the product of simply not allowing herself any other option. When the boardroom door opened, it was Caelan. He came in fast, saw her under the table, and crossed the room in 4 strides. He crouched down in front of her, his hands finding her face before he'd said a word, and the expression he was wearing was not the boardroom expression. It was not any expression she had a name for. It was the face of a man who had run 43 floors of stairwell in 11 minutes. "Are you hurt?" he said. No. His hands were still framing her face. He was looking at her the way she had watched him look at the things that mattered most to him. The operations that lived in locked rooms and encrypted files, the people he had decided were worth protecting. "Caelan," she said. "Yes, I'm fine." "I know," he said. "I know you are." He didn't move his hands. "I need you to know," he said, with the controlled difficulty she'd heard from him before, "that this, you, whatever you're carrying right now, I need you to know that I am not going to let anything happen to you. That's not a line. That's not a negotiation position. That is the most important thing in my life right now." She looked at him. "Imogen, that's the second time you've called me that in 6 years," she said. "I'm making up for lost time." She put her hand over his and felt the steadiness of him, the specific steadiness of someone who had spent decades being the most dangerous thing in the room and had decided somewhere between March and December that there was something worth being careful with. "Okay," she said. "I believe you." By February, she had moved exactly 3 things into his place: her most used financial reference books, a lamp she'd owned since Georgetown that cast the right light for reading, and a coffee maker that was significantly better than his. He did not comment on the lamp. He moved the books to a shelf where they fit. He threw out his old coffee maker without being asked. She noticed. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The morning she told him the pregnancy was still ongoing, that everything was healthy, and the due date was mid-August, they were in the kitchen. She was sitting at the island with the ultrasound printout on the counter between them and the very good coffee in her hands, and she told him the information as she always told him information, directly with the relevant details, without softening the frame. He put down his cup. He picked up the ultrasound. He was quiet for a very long time. She watched his face move through something that he had no practiced expression for, something that didn't come from the boardroom or the back rooms or the decades of cultivated control. "Mid-August," he said. 15th, they think. Give or take. He looked up from the printout. His eyes were darker than usual. "I know this isn't what either of us," she started. "Stop," he said. "Not sharp. Careful, don't do that. Don't pre-apologize for something that doesn't need apologizing. I'm not apologizing. I'm contextualizing Imogen." He set the printout down. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, and he was looking at her the way he had in the boardroom on the floor. That look she still had no name for, the one that wasn't armor and wasn't strategy. "I'm not good at telling you what I feel. I'm aware of the irony given that I manage people for a living. But I need you to understand that this," he touched the counter beside the printout, "is not something I'm going to manage. It's something I want." She held his gaze. "So do I," she said, "for the record." "Good," he said. "Then we're in agreement. We're usually not." "I know. Enjoy it while it lasts." She almost smiled. She had been almost smiling considerably more often in the past several months than in the 6 years before, which she was choosing to read as a net positive. What she was not choosing to think about was the men from December, who had turned out to be advance scouts for an operation that had spent 3 months trying to identify and locate a financial intelligence source inside Thorn Capital. What she was not choosing to think about was the fact that they had come for her specifically, because someone had been watching the flow of the firm's restructured accounts and triangulated the analyst responsible. They had done, in other words, exactly what she had done 18 months into the job. Caelan had handled it. He had handled it in the way of his world, which she was not fully informed about and did not ask to be. What she did ask was whether it was over. "For now," he said. "Is that the best you can give me?" That's the honest answer. She respected honest answers more than comfortable ones. That was probably why she had stayed for 6 years. The meeting that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in March, exactly 1 year from the night of the safe room. Caelan called her into a meeting that turned out not to be a meeting. It was the full leadership structure of the Thorn organization, 12 men and 2 women seated around the table where she had presented financial reports for 6 years, and the expressions on their faces ranged from neutral to openly assessing. She had known about the structure. She had not known she was going to be stood in front of it. Caelan stood at the head of the table. "I want to be clear about something," he said, in the voice he used when he wanted zero ambiguity. "The work that has protected this organization's financial integrity for the past 6 years has been Imogen Farley's, not in a supporting role, not as a function of a department, directly, personally, and with a level of intelligence and discretion that has kept us clean through 3 federal reviews, 1 major asset seizure attempt, and the December situation." He paused. "She is carrying my child. She is my partner in every relevant sense of the word. And she will be treated as such by everyone in this room and everyone in this organization, starting immediately and without exception." The table was quiet. She stood at the side of the room with her hands folded in front of her, and she looked at the 12 faces looking back at her, and she thought about the fluorescent lit break room and the cold sandwich and the 6 years of being furniture, and she breathed. One of the men at the table, older, silver-haired, a man she knew managed the Boston operations, leaned forward. "She's an outsider," he said. "She's the reason your Q4 positioning survived the DOJ inquiry," Caelan said. "I'd revise your framing." Silence. The silver-haired man sat back. Imogen looked at Caelan. He was already looking at her. Not the boardroom look, not the armor. The real one. The look that had taken 6 years to surface and was now apparently not going back under. She gave him a small nod. He gave her nothing in return, outwardly. Just held her gaze for 1 second before turning back to the table. She had learned to read him by now. She knew that 1 second was everything. She walked back to her office. Her office, not a desk in the open floor, an office she had moved into in January when the nature of her role was quietly acknowledged to have changed. And she sat down and she opened the reconciliation report she'd been working on before the meeting, and she went back to work, because the work was still interesting. That had not changed. What had changed was that she no longer had to pretend she didn't know what the work was part of, and she no longer had to pretend she wasn't seen, and she no longer had to eat her lunch alone in fluorescent light while the world celebrated someone else. Outside her window, New York moved the way it always did, fast, indifferent, enormous, full of people who had no idea what happened 43 floors, up in a building that smelled like leather and money and something quietly dangerous. She turned back to the numbers, 17 discrepancies. She'd had them since March of last year. She found the last one at 6:43 p.m., just as the light was going gold across the city, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a thing finally balanced. The books, the numbers, the architecture she had built over 6 years in the dark. All of it finally adding up.